I am really delighted today to bring to you two members of the energy media. The first is Tina Davis, and Tina is with Bloomberg. She heads up the America's Bloomberg Energy Desk. I think that's quite impressive, and I can't wait to have her come and speak about the book she wrote, along with Jessica Resnick-Ault, who is with Thomson Reuters. And these ladies are going to come and talk about the book that they wrote called Hess, the Last Oil Baron, specifically about the lessons in leadership learned from Hess. And at some point we'll stop and then we'll get to have a conversation about energy in the media and get some perspectives from them and the time that they've spent working the energy beat, which I'm sure has been a fascinating and interesting experience. So I'm going to call Jessica and Tina up to the stage.
We're going to sit. Yes, we're going to sit. We debated, but after long and contentious battle, decided to sit, mostly because I have a lot of respect for the speakers before us who are speaking without notes, but to be honest, I drank a lot in college, so I need a little bit of a reminder. Jessica, however, as she told me just today, won a regional competition in extemporaneous speaking, is that correct?
In high school.
In high school. So she's an old pro.
Resting on those laurels.
Right, for just a little while. So I'll begin with just a little bit of an explanation of why we wrote this book, which is probably the question we get most often. Jessica and I, as was mentioned, are both journalists. We were former colleagues, now we're sworn enemies working for different news organizations. But there came a time, not too long ago, some of you may remember, when Hess came under attack, Hess the corporation came under attack from an activist shareholder, which is an idea that will resonate with a lot more people since then. And so we were writing about Hess pretty much on a daily basis. And every time we wrote about them, someone else above the food chain from us would send in a request saying, oh, you have to mention that Leon Hess owned the Jets football team, or you have to mention the toy trucks. For those of you raised in the Northeast, you'll know what I'm talking about. Yeah. Somebody does, right? People from Houston just smile and nod because you're not going to understand this. But for anyone who's lived in the Northeast, the Hess Corporation used to put out, or they still do actually, and now it's online because they don't own the stations anymore, but they put out an annual toy truck. And you can probably hum the theme song. I would do it, but you really don't want to hear me sing. So anyway, so we were writing about Hess, and we realized that this was a company and a man, really, whose life resonated in a way that you don't really think about for an oil company, right? You don't have warm feelings about ExxonMobil. You don't have, a history of caring about the owner of Marathon. You just don't. And this is a guy whose life was very different and whose company was very different. So neither one of us are historians, but we decided to try to tackle a life story, and also because we're business journalists, to look at the history of the company as well. So it's not just about Leon Hess the person, it's also about the organization that he founded and sort of shepherded from a single secondhand fuel truck into a $30-some billion multinational organization. So having said that, why should you care about a guy who's been dead for 17 years? What can he teach you? We want to go through just a couple of the lessons that we think we found from looking at his life, from looking at the way he ran his organization and grew it into the mini Exxon that it became under his leadership. And I guess first and foremost, I think one of the things that we both found really compelling, and one of the sort of takeaways, was that this was a man who was really good at finding mentors. And I think it's a lesson, that can move everyone into the present day, regardless of where you are. He found a mentor in a man named David Willens, who was an attorney general of New Jersey and somewhat of a celebrity in his own right. He was the prosecutor at the time who prosecuted the Lindbergh baby kidnapping. I don't know if that rings any bells for anyone, Charles Lindbergh's son was kidnapped and later killed, and he was the attorney general who went after the person who was accused of that crime. So he found a mentor in someone who was really extremely well connected in the state of New Jersey, which is where Leon grew up. And this guy really led to helping him find opportunities beyond just what he was doing at the time, and really became a way for him to network into a lot of political friends, a lot of friends who would help expand the business beyond, just selling residual fuel oil to a few utilities.
David was, without a doubt, the most important person in Leon's life. He expanded the business, as Tina said. He gave him ideas for seeing beyond what had been a very limited upbringing. Leon was the son of a kosher butcher. His parents had immigrated from Lithuania. Neither one spoke very much English, if any. And yet, Leon really defined himself in very different, very broad terms. And his model for doing that really was David Wilentz. One of the most interesting things, perhaps, is that he ended up marrying David's daughter. But that's sort of a social aspect of it. And from a business aspect, what's so compelling is that he found a role model who was in a completely different field and a completely different business from his own. And it really raises the possibility of considering who your role models and mentors can be, and how it's possible not just to find someone who's in the office down the hall or the same company or even a similar company, but to find someone who really shares your core values and can help you develop a business that's in line with those ideals.
Yeah, and I think building on that a little bit, one of the things that both these men had in common was that they were not afraid of risk. And I think one of the resounding lessons from Leon's life, was mentioned in the prior panel, that women are not starting businesses perhaps because they are afraid of taking risks. And I think when you look at the sort of life of this man who was seeing opportunity, and this is, I feel like I don't have to explain to this audience what residual fuel oil is, but it's sort of the bottom of the barrel. It's at the time, it was what refineries were essentially throwing away. They just wanted to get rid of it. And he found a use for that and a way to sort of keep it warm, sometimes by using blow torches, which I would not recommend, but a way to sort of sell that to people who needed it, and he found the way to sort of logistically make that happen. So he was someone who was not afraid of risk. He was raised, as Jessica mentioned, by immigrant parents. His father had had a series of businesses, some of which had been successful, some of which failed. And he actually started the business out of the ashes of his father's failed business.
At the end of the Depression.
At the end of the Depression, obviously, another downturn. So one of the lessons here is when you do have risk, there is also opportunity if you can find a way.
For sure. I think that one of the most interesting things is that even though he remained very skeptical of Wall Street as Wall Street emerged as a major factor in the oil markets and in the oil industry, even though he retained that skepticism, he also realized that he had to embrace change, and he had to embrace the way that the market was starting to shape oil companies and the way that oil companies were starting to take a position in the market. And he did take a risk in that area. He first tried to form a trading venture in the 80s, and it didn't work out so well. And then he came back to it again in the 90s, and he founded HETCO, which many of you probably know, which now stands alone as part of Oaktree, and was a very, very successful trading firm that really cornered the Brent market in a way that he couldn't have possibly foreseen. But he was not totally burned by that first failure in trading and was willing to go back at it. And it was a sort of persistence that was really remarkable.
Yeah, and just to build a little bit on that, Leon Hess was notoriously reclusive. And there's one lengthy interview with him that was ever published during his lifetime. He was famous for saying no to the press on a pretty regular basis. But the reason he did that one long interview with Business Week magazine was because it was the 80s, as Jessica mentioned. He had been caught out making a series of wrong way bets on which way oil would head, and his company was suffering, and there was talk about it being taken over. And he mentions, in the interview that there were days where he did not want to get up. He knew that he'd put his entire venture in trouble because of decisions that he'd made, and every day he was having to get up and see an oil price that was falling below where he'd bet that it was headed. But I think, as Jessica said, one of the other great hallmarks to his leadership style was that he was someone who allowed for mistakes, both by himself and by others. His mantra was essentially, if you make a mistake, you learn from it and you move on, which, I was telling Jessica earlier, one of my friends who runs her own business that she started after being laid off after the financial crisis, she said that she wants to staple that to the walls of every building that she has now because, there's a freedom in that. There's a freedom in allowing your people to fail, and letting them acknowledge the failure, learn from the failure, and then moving on from there.
One of their sort of remarkable, I don't want to call it a failure per se, but one of their remarkable failures, I think, was in a unit called Microgen, and it's outside of oil. It was something they were dabbling in toward the end of Leon's life. And the idea was that this oil company, Hess, had taken a position in a venture that would put little micro generators on top of hotels and other facilities across the United States and ultimately around the world. Microgen suffered from a series of leadership challenges, from a series of overspending and under profiting, and ultimately was closed. I think he moved on, he and John at that point, who was taking an increased role in the business, his son moved on from Microgen fairly gracefully and didn't look back. And I think that ability to say, okay, this is a venture that didn't work out, we're going to jettison it and move forward, focus on what we do well, and what we're going to take away from this particular failure is that we have spread our business too thin, that we've extended into areas that we're not truly experts in, and we need to reel things back. And I think that the ability to do that and to move on was something he, I think, had instilled in John. And even under John, that continued to be sort of a major tenet under which the company operated.
Yeah, and I'll just take up another sort of quick anecdote. Leon loved to gamble. He owned a racetrack, or part of a racetrack, with David Williams and some other folks. But he was also, as I said, someone who took risks, but also allowed people to fail. And he also really enjoyed negotiating. He was an oil man. He was a Jewish man who was doing a lot of business with Arabic leaders on a regular basis, some of whom did not want to do business at the time with Jewish people in general. So he was someone who was not afraid to sort of get involved where others might have felt that their circumstances would hold them back, that they wouldn't be allowed a seat at the table just before you're even walking in the room, introducing yourself. But as I said, he's the man who really loved negotiating. There's a great story that's being told when he owned the Jets, and initial talk came about moving the Jets out of New York City. For those not from New York City or New York, we have two football teams that are named New York, and neither one of them actually play in New York. And Leon Hess is part of the reason why. During the 80s, the team was playing at Shea Stadium, which is where the Mets baseball team plays. And he abhorred the facilities there. He felt that they were terrible. They were sort of treated as second-class citizens.
They had to share them with the baseball team.
Yeah, the facilities were essentially built for a baseball team and were converted in the fall and winter to so that they could play football on them. So he was negotiating to potentially move the team out to New Jersey, which is where they eventually did move. And as part of those negotiations, the city was trying very hard to keep the team, essentially. And one of the stories of someone involved in the negotiations at the time was the city at the very last possible minute, I'm talking literally minutes to spare, came in with their proposal to keep the Jets and to keep them in Shea Stadium. And the person who was working with Leon took the papers and said, Mr. Hess, here's their proposal. And he said, no, get it time-stamped. So he went out to the secretary's office. I don't know if anyone remembers getting documents time-stamped, but it's before faxes even. So they took it out. So he took it out to his secretary and asked her to timestamp it. He came back in, and Leon sort of looked up surprised and said, what are you doing here? And he said, well, I got it timestamped. And he said, no, get every single page timestamped. So he went back, and they went through the process of stamping every page and brought it back to Mr. Hess. And literally 5 minutes later, a messenger arrived with a new page for that document. They'd changed the terms, and not just changed, the signing line or anything small. They changed something rather substantial that would have meant, an extra $100 million in costs. So Leon, turned to the person who'd learned the valuable lesson and just said, you'll never forget how to timestamp again, will you? And that sort of approach to negotiations where he, was very canny, again, sort of allowing people to fail, even in the safe confines that he created for them. But one of the things that brings up as well is his real desire to sort of know who he was dealing with at all times. And I think one of the things, everyone wants to write, well, not everyone. When you write a biography, what you're hoping to find is just stumbling across Kitty Kelly style, a secret family, love children, something really juicy that's gonna, turn this into the cover of People magazine and sell you 5 million copies. And I don't know.
No love children.
Yeah, spoiler alert.
Sorry.
Spoiler alert. But anyway, one of the things that we encountered again and again when talking to people that knew Leon personally and worked at the Hess Corporation was that he was someone who talked to people at all levels. He was not someone who only, he mingled with a select crowd, but he also still had his friends from growing up in Asbury Park, on the Jersey Shore, a fairly simple upbringing, as Jessica mentioned, the son of immigrants. And even through his regular business day, Jessica had some great stories about him talking to...
The Hovensa refinery, which he operated in St. Croix, he was totally comfortable going up to anyone. And one of the people we interviewed for the book was a fellow without a high school education who was a ditch digger at Hovensa when they were building the plant. And he said to me that it was just remarkable because when Mr. Hess was there, he would just go up and talk to them. And no matter who they were or what they did at the plant, Mr. Hess would have a conversation with them. He would know spouses' names. He would know children's names. He would know their job, how long they had been at the plant, every detail about each of his employees. And so he was very comfortable going up to people and joking with them, saying, hey, son, how did you get that, bruise on your forehead? Well, I was digging and a shovel hit me. Well, that wasn't too smart, was it? He said. So he made people feel like, given his own success without having gone to college, they could also have that success because he treated them not necessarily like equals, but like valid contributors to the company.
Yeah, and I think, there's been a lot of discussion about networks and networking today, and all those are important, but you have to also realize your network is anyone you encounter every day, right? It's not simply, we're in this forced arrangement or we're having white wine and making small talk, at an agreed upon time every day. One of the people we talked to who worked closely with Leon said, Leon's great talent was information gathering before the era of the internet, right? So how do you get information about how your facility is being run? You talk to the people who are on the ground, who are digging the ditches, who can see when things are being done right or when they're being done wrong. How do you gain an advantage in negotiations with people who are adversarial? you talked obviously to the upper levels, but you talked to the people below them who are going to be the ones making the actual decisions. One of the people who was at his side for a lot of negotiations told us that he really specialized in finding the number two. There's always going to be this sort of C-suite level folks who are in charge, but his talent was to find the people who make the decisions, who are not always the people, at the CEO or CFO level in these cases.
And in terms of trying to have boots on the ground who could report back to him, he was very careful not only in having his own mentor, but in serving as an informal mentor to dozens of people across the company. So there was a man who many called sort of a mini Leon at Hovensa, who would report back to him on exactly what was going on there, and who did try to emulate his style of, again, knowing everyone's names and details. And the same was said for his gas stations in Connecticut, for his refinery in Mississippi, for his oil fields in Oklahoma. Across the country, he had these sort of deputies who were able to do the information gathering for him.
Right, and part of that is another sort of life lesson that I got, which was his incredible attention to detail. You've heard it sort of mentioned a little bit here. I mean, this was a guy who, at a board meeting, took a dime out to tighten the screw on a chair that was loose. And this was a man who paid attention to things around him. He's someone who tried to revolutionize the gas station industry by having clean bathrooms. His idea was if you have clean bathrooms, then women won't be afraid to stop there. And women are going to tell the men when we need to stop and where I want to go. Part of that is painting the white curb out in front of the gasoline station to make it look appealing. All these things are very small things. We have an example, too, of him well after a time when he was in control and could hire people to do this, parking his car outside of a gas station just to see the traffic flow through the gas station and to count the cars coming in and out. This was something that he could have easily delegated to somebody, but he was that focused on, before he made that decision to buy that gas station, he wanted to know everything he could about what was happening there.
He was known to go stop to get his own car filled up, and the station attendants would wait 45 minutes to see what happened when he got back to his office and whether or not they were going to get a call complaining about how they were maintaining the station. So there was always fear, that he would find some sort of fault, that a curb wasn't perfect.
Yeah, and even just beyond necessarily looking for the negatives, he was someone who, we mentioned the toy truck. This was something that he felt very powerfully connected to. It became a brand representative for Hess, so that we have a whole chapter on the toy truck because there's now sort of a cult of collectors. So if you have some old ones, please don't open the box, is my recommendation. But there are people who specialize in gluing back on the side mirrors if you've somehow knocked them off in the course of owning this particular toy. These things are, some of them are worth thousands of dollars now. And when this was created, nobody had thought of selling toys at a gas station. Why would you do that? Well, again, it's a reason for people to come into your gas station during the holidays especially. And it's something that differentiates you from, Joe Schmo on the corner who's selling essentially the same product. Really, there's not a lot of difference. But if you look for the small ways to differentiate yourself, and as I said, this was something that he felt so strongly about. He approved every year the design of the toy truck.
And his son continued to do that. So not only was it attention to detail, but it was also attention to tradition. He understood how important it was not only to offer the truck once, but to make sure that every year people knew exactly what to expect and that it was of a standard that met his benchmarks. And so he instilled this in his son, and John continued to individually approve the truck. And in fact, when Hess sold its gas stations to Marathon, some people who were involved in that process told us that one of the major sticking points was the truck, because it was so important to Hess that they continue to distribute the truck. Even after they no longer had the gas stations, they saw that they had created this really important symbol of their company that had engendered a really large response, particularly in the Northeast, and they wanted to maintain that. And it was critical to sort of their corporate identity and their relationship with their customers to continue to make that available.
Right. And this is, this has all been fairly sunny. We're not trying to, this wasn't, a hagiography of Leon Hess. This was a businessman. This was a businessman who did business one time, apparently, according to him, with a loaded gun on the table between him and the person that he was negotiating with. And I think one of the lessons that I've seen from looking at his life is the way that he was really unapologetic about taking advantages where he saw them. This was a man, as we mentioned, who had a mentor who was very well politically connected. Leon himself dabbled in politics. And when I say dabble, I mean he was the single largest contributor to Richard Nixon's re-election campaign during a rather unfortunate year. So he was someone who tried to find advantages, would use them, and was really never sorry for them. I mean, some of one of the prior panelists jokingly mentioned that because she's Canadian, she says sorry, but this was someone who didn't really say sorry. In fact, it took a call from Vice President Mondale in the 80s, in the 70s, I'm confusing my eras, in the 70s during the height of the Arab embargo and all of the problems that happened with fuel deliveries, Vice President Mondale personally called Leon asking him not to charge so much for gasoline. And prior to that, Leon's approach had been, I will charge what the market will bear. And his argument was, we have been essentially screwed, for lack of a better word, on margins for so many years. Now I'm finally profitable. How dare you tell me not to make a profit? And you could talk a little bit about some of the other advantages.
There were other advantages that he took. So, for example, through his relationship with David Wilentz, his father-in-law by that time, he had a great in with the New Jersey political community. So when he wanted to build a refinery in the Virgin Islands, he went to the governor of New Jersey. And he had them put political pressure that sort of trickled up and ended up getting him this prime position in the Virgin Islands at a time when companies, including Exxon and other key competitors, were putting refineries across the Caribbean. So he used his political connections to really get Hess a prime spot and a terrific tax break deal in an island that otherwise might have been resistant to him.
Yeah, he actually managed, this is one of the sort of great things. I'm a former political reporter, so I really appreciate someone who can really game the system perfectly like this. He manages to make somehow that facility both within the United States and not within the United States. For those of you familiar with the Jones Act, he managed to sort of circumvent that so that they were not a U.S. territory except for tax reasons, then they were a U.S. territory. So, I mean, it's an incredibly canny individual who, as I said, took his advantages where he saw them and was never apologizing about his ability to move with those things. Having said that, I will transition ever so slightly to talk a little bit about the character of the man and how that influenced his company. One of the major reasons that Jessica and I found this company so fascinating is that it's still, as she mentioned, it's run by his son. So it's, in some ways, it's a family business. It's a family business in which 90% of the shareholders are not the family. So it's somewhat unique to hand that off to a son. And it's also, I mean, there's a lot of dynasties. You think about the oil industry, the Hunt brothers, and other folks who have tried to do this, but the Murphys. But this is one clear example of a publicly traded entity that's been handed down from father to son. And there's some talk that John is grooming his own son to potentially take over the company once he's done with it. This is a company that was essentially, as I said, you talk about the toy truck, you talk about the vision for the company. Leon ran this company as a family. And I think one of the things that, as you talk to folks who worked for him, who worked with him, the feeling that you got was that because he was a person who was interacting on every level, he was someone that made it very real who his employees were working for. This wasn't just a faceless organization. This wasn't just, you know, the name on your checks or the sign on the building. This was a family. You felt like you were part of the family to some extent. You felt like you stood for something more than just profiteering. You know, it was mentioned, we mentioned in the book a little bit about Hurricane Sandy. You know, John Hess, in charge of the company at that point in time, made extra efforts to make sure fuel was available where it was needed in the Northeast. This is not something that you do for profit reasons. This is something you do because you're from that region and you care about what happens to that region at the time. He also ran the Jets football organization like it was a family. They had Thanksgiving dinners every year. And, you know, I think one of the things that was remarkable to us when we were writing about them is you have folks like Bill Parcells, for any football fans in the room, who said that he never wanted to win a Super Bowl more than he wanted to win it for Leon. Because Leon had sort of given him, had provided that sort of fatherly-like role where he had given him the ability to fail, had given him the tools that he thought that he needed to take the team all the way to the Super Bowl. They fell just short of the Super Bowl that year. But because he had felt like he had the caring, he had that sort of management role of, I'm going to help you succeed, everyone sort of bought into the vision that he had.
And it was true definitely at the company as well. We interviewed people, some of whom had been with the company for 40 years under Leon. And he had engendered this tremendous amount of loyalty because they knew that Hess wasn't just a company that expected you to put in your time and would pay you and give you benefits, but that they would be there for you. So, for example, if an employee got hurt, Leon was known to go to the hospital, to be there with the person, to provide his own private surgeon from New York to employees who were injured, to go way beyond what we would expect of our bosses, right?
Yeah, and I think, you know, not to belabor the Jets, because I'm a Redskins fan, but there's a famous story of a player on the Jets, Dennis Byrd, getting injured. Horrible, horrible injury, breaking his neck during a game. You know, we think about the NFL now and all the injuries. This was someone who faced really a catastrophic injury and was told he would never walk again. And, you know, from talking to people involved, you know, Leon Hess was at the hospital when this player was brought in. Leon Hess, as Jessica said, as he did in other instances, provided his own sort of ideas and his own medical professionals.
Yeah.
You know, this was, and then eventually he bought out his contract and made sure that he was taken care of, made sure his wife and kids were flown in and taken care of for all the surgeries that ensued. I mean, this is someone who, you know, we talk about him being a cutthroat negotiator, but ultimately, when someone on his roster, for lack of a better word, was injured, he would go above and beyond to make sure that they were taken care of. And that really flows back up to you in the form of goodwill from, you know, as a leader. If everyone else on the team sees you taking care of your people that way, you know, that only engenders a stronger bond with you as a leader.
One lesson that we definitely took away from him is he not only treated colleagues like family, but he sometimes integrated his family with his work very effectively. So in an era in which many of us feel like we need to choose work or family, he chose both. And there were people who were members of a local private swim club that the Hesses belonged to who said Leon had it down to a science. He would show up in his limo a moment before John's heat at a day-long swimming match, be there, get back into the limo, and leave.
And this is before cell phones. This is before he
cell
get
phones.
texted.
No one knew how he did it.
Yeah.
But he had set up his organization so profoundly and so deeply that he was able to sort of juggle it all. And so his family was there with him at Jets games. His daughters were recounted memories of going to his office at night when he would go back to work at the end of the day after dinner, and he would bring them with him, let them play in the office a bit.
Yeah, and just to talk about the daughters a little bit, I mean, obviously we're talking about a patriarchy, so let's discuss that first and foremost. He is a man who adopted his wife, who had been divorced. She had a daughter from her
first
previous marriage. He adopted that daughter. They had 2 children in that marriage, so he had 2 girls and a boy whom he raised. Both of the female children went on to have extremely high-powered careers. These were not, women who were raised to, stay home and cook for a living.
Right. One was at J.P. Morgan as the head of philanthropy. The other rose in politics.
Yeah,
So.
she actually ran Hillary Clinton's, or not Hillary Clinton's, Ben Bradley's presidential campaign in Pennsylvania. She rose to be a state senator in Pennsylvania. And this comes from Leon having married a woman, the daughter of David Wilentz, who was a graduate of Wesleyan and thought to be the smartest of his children.
His other children, Wilentz's other children, included a chief justice on the state Supreme Court. Yeah. So they were no slouches either.
Yeah. These are all high-powered, highly functional families, which I don't know much about. But anyway, I want to allow a little bit of time for questions. So what I will do is go ahead and thank, first of all, Katie for arranging this. This is a great session. I mean, look, Jessica and I work in a profession that is pretty heavily male-dominated. We cover an industry that is
extraordinarily
male-dominated. Male-dominated. So one of the things Katie asked us to do is, first of all, just talk about the book and life lessons from that, but also talk about the media and interaction with the media, since I know usually when you have, I don't have my badge on, but the badge has a big sign saying media on it, which I like to think,
saying don't talk
yeah, it means stay away from me a little bit. I've gone through exhibition halls with those kind of badges on, and you feel like you're parting the Red Sea as people get out of your way. So I want to encourage you, if you want to ask some questions about how the industry is being covered, or what exactly off the record means, we're happy to answer those questions as well. Anyway, thanks again, Katie, for setting this up.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Rocio Mendoza, and I am an associate with Winston & Strawn. I had a question as a young professional and you guys as members of the media on maybe some tips you have as how to use the media as our friend, like you said, instead of staying away from you guys, as a way to create our brand and to develop your practice or your profession, and just ways that you've seen young professionals be able to successfully do that, and just any pointers.
Sure. I can go ahead.
So one thing that occurs to me is know who in the media you're reaching out to. Look at the person's byline. Look at the kinds of things they've written. If you're someone who focuses on mergers and acquisitions, or on structured finance, or on whatever contracts, know who the top reporters are and the most trusted reporters are who do that. Reach out to them. Tell them that you want to talk to them off the record, and set up a rapport. And once you have that rapport, it can really be a two-way street of information flowing, and it can definitely help. I mean, I certainly, and I'm sure Tina talks to tons of people in the industry every day. We talk to lawyers, we talk to people who work at the companies, we talk to analysts who cover the companies. And personally, I always like to have background conversations with people in the industry who I haven't spoken to before, because it helps me and it helps them. And I think one question Katie was raising with us is, why does the media hate the oil industry? We don't, but you have to go.
We're not quoting you. We're not quoting you.
But you do have to know who in the media understands the oil industry, and there are lots of us. There's Tina and her team, me and my team. There are excellent, responsible reporters at the Financial Times and at the Wall Street Journal, and I was only talking about the one who she had previously hired, who left for the Wall Street Journal. But there are responsible, intelligent reporters who are well-versed in the subject matter and who would be glad to work with you.
Look, I agree with everything Jessica has said. Obviously, if you read a story that you think is good about your industry, I would reach out to that person. Secondarily, if you see news happening, I will tell you that from my standpoint, and I'll let Jessica nod or shake her head vigorously depending on how she feels about this, but from my standpoint, the person who gets quoted the most often is the one who picks up the phone when I call. I mean, sometimes it's just that easy. News is broken that morning. I need someone's opinion on it. I need someone's take on it. I'm going to reach out to the 3 people that I think are most likely to take my call. And having said that,
email me the people who say,
yeah,
hey, I worked on that deal. Because I might not know, right? I might know the top partner who was responsible for something, who's named in a press release, but I might not know that you as a young professional were the associate to that partner working on that transaction. So, say, hey, if you want to talk on background about, whatever deal is pending, not going to say them in front of the competition, but whatever deal is pending, we'll talk, but just give me a heads up that you're a contact on that too.
Yeah, I mean, look, the media business is a lot like the oil and gas business. A lot of it's just relationships, right? It's who you know, it's who you've spoken to before, it's who you've met at one of these conferences. It's basically knowing someone, getting to a state where you're trusting in that relationship, and then just answering the phone.
So I'm going to add on a little bit.
Please.
So someone had asked me this earlier. We live in a world where it seems like it's about getting the news out first and not necessarily the right information. What can you speak a little bit to that, and also talk about maybe the role social media is potentially going to play in the future of telling the story about energy?
So to get hired at Bloomberg, where Tina works and where I used to work, there used to be a test where the former editor-in-chief would ask you, what is the #1 most important thing in journalism? And you had to say accuracy. And if you did not say accuracy, you would not get the job. Similar to Bloomberg, Reuters has a similar approach on accuracy. It's one of our trust values. Certainly, it is important to be fast, but it does not matter if you're first if what you're printing is wrong, and you will lose credibility very quickly. And I know that both of our companies apply great scrutiny to reporters for their level of corrections, for how many times things need to be revised. It is unacceptable to get it wrong. And so, yes, do we have to be fast? Absolutely. But we also have to be right. And I think there's a real appreciation for that. And in an area that's as complicated as oil and gas, I think responsible reporters make a huge effort to reach out to you. And if you're working with someone and you're worried that you're not going to see the final product before it goes out, it is completely acceptable to ask that reporter not to show you the whole story, because they won't, but to walk through what's being attributed to you, to walk through the story with you and make sure that what they're saying isn't going to surprise you the next day. And
I'll talk a little bit to the social media part of that question. We live in an era in which the Venezuelan oil minister is regularly tweeting out news. And I say that with all the disdain that you can hear in my voice for having to sort of cover social media in that way. It makes things a lot more complicated for us to cover. I mean, it's made everyone's life a little bit more complicated. Easy, but also a little bit more difficult. I think part of the, and I'm speaking solely for myself here, part of the sort of disaggregation of the media is extremely helpful, because you're getting news from sources you weren't hearing from necessarily before.
the Macondo oil spill broke from fishermen tweeting it initially, right? So
Absolutely, if you say so.
It did.
You work for me then, so you should know. No, but I think part of the problems inherent with that is that it also creates a lot of noise, right? And as Jessica said, both our news organizations highly value credibility. If you're not a credible news organization, why should anyone care what news it is that you're posting or publishing or putting on broadcast television? It doesn't hold any value if it doesn't hold any credibility. So it is very much a yin-yang. As I mentioned, you have to pay attention to what's happening. You have to pay attention to what your competitors are doing. But at the same time, you have to try to avoid some of the noise aspect of some of the social media.